Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today, we will be discussing democracy under siege. Don't let them lock it down with Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, Mr. Frank Furedi. Mr. Furedi, thank you for your time, sir.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
What is democracy and why is it a morally justified system people should embrace?
Well, democracy basically has got two aspects to it. It comes from the Greek of demokratia, which means, first of all, the demos, which is really the people. And it's about people having a voice and having a degree of control over their lives. And the second part comes from kratia, which means power. So that democracy actually encompasses both the people and where power should be based. And its importance lies in the fact that through the exercise of your voice and through decision making, citizens are able to play a role in their public affairs. And what's wonderful about democracy for me more than anything else is that all citizens are politically equal. You know, some might be rich, some might be poor, some might be handsome, some might be ugly, some might be short or tall or gifted and not gifted. But when it comes to public life as citizens, we all have the same degree of political equality, which I think is important because as long as we're politically equal, there's always a potential for us to change our world or make sure that the world is run according to our own inclinations.
Now, I want to bring up a number of principled objections to democracy that I, as a libertarian, have, just so I could really get an understanding of your thesis here. Could there be a downside to people being equally influential? For example, if someone knows a lot about flying an airplane or doing brain surgery or building a house, should they have just as much of an influence on houses and brain surgery and computers as someone like me who knows nothing about those things?
No, because we make a distinction between matters that are not political. So, for example, you know, when I got a problem with my brain, I'll go to a brain surgeon rather than get my wife to fix the issue. And you know, when I want to get a house built, I'll get an architect who will have that kind of special kind of expertise. So there is no reason for arguing that everybody should have an equal say in all dimensions of human experience. The point that I would make is that when it comes to politics, there is no such thing as expertise. In other words, we haven't got political experts, although I know that some people claim to be political experts. But you know, when it comes to knowing what's in your own interest, you know, you should get to decide how you project your interest into public life, rather than this guy with a PhD in political science, or rather than this priest or this individual who claims to have these special kind of powers. And it seems to me that as long as we recognize that expertise is okay when it's confined to its own area, but when it comes to politics, all of us have an equal say, then I think we can begin to go forward in a positive direction.
There is, oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, and I was going to say, but there's no contradiction between radical democracy and being libertarian. I think that the two actually go hand in hand, but often a lot of libertarians misunderstand the dynamic that's behind democracy. That in fact, democracy is the only guarantee of liberty. There is no other way you can guarantee liberty. You know, you can't guarantee liberty on a piece of paper. You can't say, oh, we have liberty because that's what it says on a piece of paper. The only defense we have of liberty is people's willingness to speak up.
There is a former professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and he says that democracy allows for A and B to band together to rip off C. This is not justice, but a moral outrage. How do you respond?
I think I would say that, unfortunately, a lot of academics don't trust people. They think that you and I are intuitively and instinctively selfish, and all we want to do is advance ourselves at the expense of others, which is not to say that there aren't bad people out there. But it seems to me that if we kind of recognize that on balance, it's far better to trust each other. It's far better to trust one another than to trust the state or to trust in, kind of institutions that are far away from us. Then I think that we can also understand that on balance, when we join together, our objective is to watch each other's back rather than necessarily to take away the wealth or undermine the well-being of somebody else.
Another criticism comes from Larkin Rose, the author of a book titled The Most Dangerous Superstition. He says that if you and I don't individually have the right to issue taxes to people, or if we don't have the right to regulate other people, how do we then have the right to delegate that to a representative? So if I don't have the right to invade Iraq, how can I vote for Tony Blair to invade Iraq on my behalf?
Well, I think there is a problem of accountability, and I think that is a tricky problem of how you hold your representatives to account. And this is something that I haven't got an answer for. I mean, I got ideas about it because it very much depends on context, and it depends upon the kind of institutional arrangements that we have, whereby regular elections, in some cases, the right to recall people can play a very important role. Public pressure can become very important in relation to this. But the one thing I do know is that despite the tricky character representation, the only guarantee, the best way of holding people to account is public pressure. It's when Tony Blair knows and understands that a lot of people, will be really, really pissed off if he goes into Iraq, and a lot of people will try to do whatever they can to prevent that from happening. And certainly a lot of people will indicate that he will never be re-elected again. It's only when the public speaks with a strong voice that representatives know that we're watching their backs. And I think that the big problem, the big challenge for us is to make sure that the public is aware, is educated, is responsible, and knows that it's got a duty to keep an eye on to sleep for 2 years or 4 years until the next election comes. But that's a battle that we'll have forever. We'll never resolve that issue of how you overcome the tension between the people and their representative.
One thing I learned from Professor Bryan Caplan at George Mason University is he said that voters, by all the empirical data we have, tend to be very ignorant, not because they're bad and conspiring against us, but the cost of getting informed is so high. It takes so much time and effort and energy, things you spend time you can't spend with your family doing things you love. And for all that time, effort, and energy, you get a in America, it's like a 1 in 150 million chance at changing the outcome of an election. Is there something inherent in democracy that doesn't allow for an incentive for the masses to really get involved because the likelihood of them influencing the outcome is so small?
Well, it depends. If people feel that their voices matter, then they will get stuck in, and they do, and they will get informed, and they will make things happen. Even in my own life, I can give you examples where this has happened. For example, in England, where I live, we had a situation where for decades and decades and decades, how you voted made no difference, because in some places, even if a donkey was the candidate, the Labour Party would get elected because that was a Labour seat. In another seat, no matter who you were, you could be a complete idiot. A conservative will get elected because that's the way people voted. It's been going on for a long time. And then along comes this referendum over Brexit, of leaving the European Union. And suddenly, for the first time in people's lives, a lot of people felt that this time, the way they voted would make a huge difference. It was no longer clear what the outcome would be. There was no direct, there wasn't a Labour or a Tory seat. The outcome was unclear. And I saw with my own eyes, a lot of people just wake up and, and actually say to me, Frank, this is really so exciting. I've never had this feeling before that I'm going to do something that can make a big difference and can actually change the world. And the morning after Brexit, in the area where I live, which was principally a Brexit voting area, people were just laughing, and I've never seen them so happy. I went into my butcher shop, and I see everybody behind the counter smiling and laughing and everything else. And So what, what's, why are you so happy, guys? I said, look, we actually did something for the first time that actually it makes history. And these are ordinary people who felt, and quite rightly felt, that they had defied the establishment, they had defied our elites, and create a situation where Britain potentially can regain some of its sovereignty. So those things can happen if people think that their vote matters. And our job, I think, is to create circumstances where people understand that they can make things happen. Voting need not be this kind of boring activity of putting a piece of paper in a box. It could be something much more creative.
I want to quote from a book you address in your book, Democracy Under Siege. It's called Against Democracy by Jason Brennan, professor at Georgetown. There's two quotes here. The problem with political decisions isn't that most of us don't get our own way. It's that these decisions are usually imposed on us against our will by threats of violence. Democracy, as we practice it, is unjust. We expose innocent people to high degrees of risk because we put their fate in the hands of ignorant, misinformed, irrational, biased, and sometimes immoral decision makers. How do you respond?
Well, I think that Jason needs to get a life. He basically has this very kind of pessimistic outlook on people. He doesn't really think very much of them. And the way that he sees it is that there's this kind of fatalistic tendency to assume the worst in the political process. And I think that fatalism is very strong in your country, in America. It's strong in Europe as well, where we just assume that things are never going to change. Things are just going to carry on in the same way. That politics is pointless. I mean, the number of times I've heard that, it's completely pointless because the same people will always rule us and all the rest of that. And actually, sort of what they don't seem to understand is that at the end of the day, our freedoms depend on people living freely. And living freely means acting democratically. I think that's the way it is. And sometimes we make mistakes. You made mistakes in your life. I made mistakes in my life. Sometimes we vote in idiots, sort of, and we say, my God, how did we ever elect this person? How could we have been so silly? But at the end of the day, people you vote in, you can also remove. You might have to wait a little while, but you can still remove them. And instead of just kind of writing of the process, it's far more constructive to learn the lessons. Is there any way that we can behave and act whereby we minimize the chances of doing things wrongly?
In a book, Democracy, the God That Failed, the professor from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Hoppe, says that one of the shortcomings with democracy is it takes away a distinct class consciousness. So if you have, the ruled and the rulers, well, then you could see one group and the other have sort of conflicting interests. But with democracy, when the populace sees the representatives as an extension of themselves, they're less likely to hold them accountable and say, hey, that war you're committing is mass murder. Your regulations are causing innocent people to starve. Your sanctions are killing people. When they see them as an extension of themselves, they just say, well, I don't want to criticize myself. Therefore, we're going to let the state get away with more atrocities than we otherwise would if it were a monarch. How would you respond to that logic?
The way that I would answer that logic is that by and large, you'll find that the more democratic a society is, historically, the more they are able to hold their leaders to account, the more able to prevent acts of tyranny and acts of war, unnecessary wars which are being kind of created. There are examples when democratically elected people end up doing terrible things abroad. That also happens. But it seems to me that people, the conflict of interest between people is an issue that depends upon public life. So for example, what I worry about, people don't see the conflict of interest between them and politicians. I think most people in their heart of hearts don't trust politicians. And I know even in America, when I visit America, I go to small towns, they often make fun of politicians and they very, very much know that they're not like they are. There's a big difference between them. Well, where there's a problem is that a lot of Americans, like a lot of English people, very often don't understand the power of not the politicians, but for example, the cultural elites, the kind of way in which their lives are being impacted by Netflix, for example. I mean, whenever I watch Netflix, I know exactly, the narrative of who's good and who's bad, how you're supposed to think. They don't tell you this is the way you got to think, but the sensitive person is always a woman, or a child. You never find a man who is, particularly sensitive or emotionally literate. The very clear message is being given to you, and that's a much more difficult thing for people to understand than the behavior of the politicians. So I think that on balance, democracy is not a problem for understanding the conflicts of interest. It's also not a problem for dealing with the media and culture, as long as we have enough people in the public square who are opening their mouth and yelling and shouting and say, look at them, look what's going on. We cannot put up with that. That's what we need. People with strong backbone who are prepared to stand up and act as democratic leaders at all levels of society.
Another criticism of democracy says that when people were criticizing, the old world order of monarchs, they assumed that the problem with monarchs was the elitist nobility characteristic that they had of crowns and being wealthy and living lavish lives, when the actual problem is that one group, the state, was claiming the right to do things no other organization had: the right to tax, the right to go to war, the right to regulate, the right to conscript and force labor upon innocent people. It's the double standard in society. When the state does it, it's okay. If any of us tried to do it to anyone else, we'd be seen as terrorists or thieves or anything. What do you think about the problem with the old world order was not a lack of democracy, but a lack of either property rights or just knowledge the average person had to trade freely?
But I think all those things are linked together. When you haven't got a voice, when you are denied freedom, then your economic status is precarious, and your rest of your life is also quite insecure. But if you look at some of the best examples of the revolts against tyranny and monarchy, I'm thinking, for example, of the English Civil War. It was unapologetically about property rights. It was unapologetically about the fact that we need to be able to take control of our destiny, not just in terms of political representation, but in the running of society. It was about free speech and freedom. If you read Milton's poetry during the Civil War, the first person to write rigorously about the fact that we need to have a voice that is free in order to even know where we are or what we are about. So I would say the revolt against monarchy, often is very positive and is very inspiring. In some cases, people just reacted against their monarchs in a very narrow-minded, oh, they're just a bunch of rich people, will revolt, and then they were incapable of protecting themselves when the next tyrant, maybe not in a monarchical fashion, came along.
Another criticism of democracy is that with representatives, you have temporary caretakers of a nation. And these temporary caretakers, much like if you're just renting a car, you're not going to treat it very well. Whereas if there's either a monarch or everything is privatized in like anarcho-capitalism, then you have an incentive to hold up the well-being of your property because you then are responsible for it. But with temporary caretakers, their incentive is to get in, loot everything as fast as possible before the next guy comes in and has to loot, also known as the tragedy of the commons. How do you respond to the tragedy of the commons with regard to political representatives?
I think that it's a complicated question, but I think the key thing is that we need to have a system of personal incentives that are linked and coupled to their people's interests. So as you're suggesting, people living in a community, if they know that the work they put in to building a park or building a gym for the children or for making the pathway along their river safe and beautiful, if they know that that effort is going to be, in a sense, something that they owe in the long run, they will put in a lot of work, and that will have some very positive consequences, because there's an incentive, both individually and community-wide, to make those things happen. I think that with politicians and with many members of the establishment, there is an unfortunate short-termist sort of sensibility, which basically means, well, we're going to be here for 4 years, we're going to be maybe here for 8 years, sort of, and therefore we don't have to think of what's going to happen 20 years from now, 30 years from now. That's a problem, but that's not a problem of democracy. That's a problem of the fact that we haven't developed the kind of sense of moral responsibility. I mean, you understand at the moment, moral responsibility, which is linked to freedom, is a big problem, because a lot of Americans, for example, are not aware of the fact that it's all very well to make decisions, to be free, as long as they're prepared to live with the consequences. A lot of people are prepared to make decisions but avoid the consequences. It wasn't me, it's not my responsibility. I think that's the same everywhere in the Western world. And somehow we have got to get people to understand that if we believe in moral autonomy, in being genuinely free and acting according to our inclinations, and having the freedom to make our own choices about all aspects of our life, then it also means that when things go wrong, we're responsible for it, not somebody else. I think that kind of sensibility is something that people learn through their kind of community life, or in some cases don't learn because their community has switched off from that. And that sensibility is the one that we have to institutionalize a little bit, so that our politicians, aren't just simply thinking of today, but understand that their actions, which have consequences in the long run, must be kind of mediated in such a way that they don't do harm for the rest of us.
Here is a quote that I found in opposition to the idea of democracy. What is true, just, and beautiful is not determined by popular vote. The masses everywhere are ignorant, short-sighted, motivated by envy, and easy to fool. Democratic politicians must appeal to these masses in order to be elected. Whoever is the best demagogue will win. Almost by necessity, then, democracy will lead to the perversion of truth, justice, and beauty. How do you respond?
Well, I think, again, you're kind of quoting a lot of people, a lot of sad people who, sort of seem to think the worst of people. The first part I agree with. I agree with the fact that, sort of what is beautiful, what is truthful is not something you can determine by people voting. That's not an accomplishment that takes place through elections. I disagree with the second part, that people are just this bunch of idiots who will, sort of vote in tyrants. The point is that it can often be the case, sort of, and certainly if I was living in the United States, I would say truth is the possession in the United of a small minority, right? Because politically we live in a world where, political ideas are unfortunately, sort of going in the wrong direction, certainly from my point of view. So something like truth and beauty is not something that's going to be arrived at through elections. It's truth and beauty has got to do with our individual sensibilities. And it's something that we cultivate. Our sense of beauty and truth is cultivated by our individual behavior. And of course, the more we do that, the more we're then also able to play the role of responsible citizens, of good citizens at the same time. But we mustn't pack everything onto democracy, onto elections, because there's other ways in which positive attributes can be acquired that are not necessarily done through the political process.
There is a thought experiment that Dr. Thomas Woods Jr. from Columbia University says that we should sort of think about when looking at why people see government sort of as a unique institution. He says, well, imagine if all the schools in a nation were run by Walmart, and you had to go to Walmart school under compulsory school laws. And every, year you'd sort of learn about the different Walmart CEOs and their accomplishments, and you'd look at all the great things Walmart's done. Well, obviously, this population would not be able to assess Walmart objectively, or you could do the same thing for the Catholic Church. So if we have government schools that are compulsory funding and compulsory attendance, do you think it sort of poisons the well with regard to the voting populace? Like they're always going to look in favor of the state when the state's controlling kindergarten through 12th grade education?
I think the question of schools and education are very, very important. And I've got a very pluralistic orientation towards schooling. So the way that I like to see it is that I think government schools are not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the curriculum. I think it's always the curriculum that's the problem. I think the key thing is to have the opportunity to have different types of schools, right? Where there are different pedagogies and there are different ways of teaching, and also where sort of some of the mainstream ideas that are pushed down children's throat can be challenged. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is a problem for me as a father. I remember when my son went to school, wasn't that long ago. Every time he came home, on every subject that he learned, there was something about the environment, how important it was to be green, and what a big problem global warming is. It comes back with geography, it's about global warming. It comes back with literature, and it's all about nature and how humanity is destroying nature. The same message was being pumped into him in every single opportunity. And I remember, sort of adopting the strategy of saying to him, look, Jacob, we are Furedis, and this is the way the Furedis think, and that's the way your school teachers think, right? So just because they tell you that doesn't mean to say that that's the way it is. I had to do that. In an ideal world, I could have sent him to a school, where that kind of ideals or that kind of propaganda wasn't being promoted all the time. So I think that in an ideal world, we have different kind of schools where you can choose, sort of you can make that kind of choices, and that like to me, it's a combination of having good public schools, good private schools, communities kind of establishing their own schools, and under those circumstances, I think we will come up with the best mix, the best kind of combination.
One of the criticisms of democracy is that it's almost impossible to allocate blame. So in America, we have a drug war that is extremely unpopular if you ask the average person, but none of the politicians are accountable because they didn't pass the laws. Only a few people were some decades ago. The police say we're not responsible, we just enforce the law. The judges say we're not responsible, we just render opinions on what the law is. And the citizens who vote say, well, it's not my fault. I only had a choice between, two politicians. Neither of them were running against a drug war. Or even if you did vote for the current incoming president who talked about marijuana legalization, now it's off of his platform now that he's elected. So what do you think about the problem of holding people accountable when you sort of don't have a clear distinction between those who are responsible for the laws and those who vote and those who are subject to the laws?
I think the solution to that is to clarify this problem, because the problem you describe, I call responsibility evasion, which occurs when you outsource decision making to non-elected bodies, and politicians like to do that. So, very often what politicians do is they say, look, it wasn't us, it was the judiciary that decided that this is the way it was going to happen. Or what they do in Europe is they say, oh, it wasn't us that wanted to introduce this kind of law. We were forced by international court or the World Health Organization or some global organization told us that we must behave in this way, otherwise you're breaking international law. Or they say, oh, like during the pandemic, it's not us that want us to impose a quarantine on this town. It's the experts, the scientists that tell us to do that. So what you have all the time is the outsourcing of decision making to different kinds of bodies, which basically means that it's not me. It wasn't me who done that. To that is to depoliticize the experts. In other words, to give them less power. I think the courts have too much power at the moment in making decisions that ought to be made in the political domain. Similarly, I think experts and regulatory bodies in America have got too much power in making decisions about all aspects of our life. I think we have to deregulate as much of our life as possible. We have to remove the judiciary from the front line of politics and also sideline expertise. And I think under those circumstances, it will become much easier to say, you, politician who was elected, is responsible for this. You voted for this. You spoke on its behalf. I think that's the kind of situation we want to get into.
What do you think about national democracy versus world democracy? Meaning, right now, we more or less have nation states that do engage in democratic operations and deliberative democracy. Would you support world democracy where everyone in the world, 18 and older, was able to vote on a world president or prime minister?
Absolutely not. I think that the idea of world democracy is an oxymoron. Democracy and the globe are antithetical for the very simple reason that decision makers who are able to make decisions for the whole world are so removed from any kind of electorate, are so disconnected from everyday life that they essentially become bureaucrats or a small oligarchy that masquerades as democratic politicians, but in fact are its very, very opposite. I think, and this is a point I allude to in the book, even national democracy is very difficult because of the problem of scale. But the nation is just about the largest entity within which democracy can be conducted. And I'm all in favor, for example, of the American federal system. I think that it's good that states have rights over a lot of different kinds of issues, because the states are more in contact, they're more in touch with the aspirations of people who live in the geographical sort of space that they kind of encounter. Whereas the federal government, is really, the United States is huge. The federal government is a little bit too removed from many aspects of community life. But we have to live with that. That's a compromise we're making, even in a national democracy, where we're struggling, to basically give meaning to democratic decision making. Because in the end, democracy works best in smaller communities where you have much more of a chance to debate and argue against one another. So yes, I think world democracy is a disaster and would lead to a completely dictatorial sort of system. It would be a totalitarian system where you and I as human beings would lose all of our power and lose our voice.
Now, I think America is still the place that has the most worker cooperatives as far as any country where research has been done. So, when dealing with worker cooperatives, you have people who are employees at the plant who constantly make the decisions through unanimous vote. Like once a month, they vote on the general rules, what we should produce, how much we should reinvest, etc. Do you see that there's a difference between people choosing to be part of a democratic system and people just being born to a geographical area where there's a democracy? I guess I'm asking, do you see a difference between voluntary democracy and involuntary democracy, an important distinction we might want to make?
But there's a distinction in that, people who are born in a community also have access to certain rights that other people don't have. Now, those rights are really quite important, the right of citizenship. But the trouble is that very often people can take those rights for granted. And when you take democracy or any other rights for granted, it very often loses its positive content, its meaning. And that's always a danger that we've got to be aware of. Whereas if you decide consciously that you want to voluntarily cooperate with other people, on the land, when you're farming, or in a workplace, that's got a different meaning to it, because you made a decision, a conscious choice. You're not taking your membership of that cooperative, of that group, for granted. It's something that you've decided, and therefore that often has much more of a meaning for you. It's to do with your own autonomous action, rather than the fact that there's a biological accident, that you were happen to be born in a certain place at a certain time.
Now, as someone who is not an American, I'm just curious if you think there is anything unique about American ideals. We have general founding documents like Common Sense by Thomas Paine, the Declaration of Independence, where you hear things like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, truth being objective. All men are created equal. No man has the right to rule over another. We are endowed with inherent rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the right to abolish government, freedom of speech, and the right to bear arms. Do you think that there's anything uniquely philosophically important about American ideals, or are we just nationalists because we were born here and we'd think the same thing if we were born in Brazil or Hungary?
I think that they're really very unique. I'm a big fan of the founding documents of the United States. I think they are quite unique. I think the American Constitution and some of the founding sort of papers are really very exciting. They kind of inspire me, even though I'm not American to this day. I think your First Amendment is a wonderful sort of piece of legislation. I think the tragedy of America is that it very often doesn't live up to these ideals. And there's always a continuous process of undermining it. I noticed, for example, the New York Times' projects where it kind of has this history project, which tries to redefine what the founding has meant. Sort of is the most grotesque example of trying to call into question the beauty and the kind of intellectual drive that was behind what the founders were doing. Very often, people find a lot of excuses as to why the First Amendment is no longer relevant. We live in a complex world. Free speech is not something that we can allow sort of without some kind of restraint. I think in America, especially in universities, people spend far more energy and devote far more of their resources to limiting free speech rather than to expand it, to make it more. So I think that seems to me to be a really, really important problem. And it seems to me that, you got this incredible document, this incredible kind of political contribution, the whole founding process, which has never happened anywhere in the world. I mean, there's nothing like it anywhere in the world. And, a lot of Americans, particularly in academia, are committed to undermining it, to corroding its kind of radical revolutionary impact. And I think that to me is a really big tragedy. And the very fact that it's happening so fast in America actually means that the very soul of America, its kind of historical soul, is being threatened by it.
We see a lot of double standards or unique criticisms being attempted by, places like the New York Times, where they'll, really bash the British for colonialism and America for slavery, even though we have slavery documents going back to like 3,000 years before Christ. We have Genghis Khan colonialism. Why do you think there is such an active attempt to harp on the West as far as an idea, or mainly criticize the West for something that actually applies to all societies and all races everywhere? Do you see that, or is that just an American thing?
Well, no, I think that Western civilization, Western culture has lost a lot of confidence in itself. And there's a kind of a cultural conflict going on, which calls into question all the most important founding principles of Western civilization. And instead of trying to live up to them and develop them further, there's a very systematic attempt to detach the legacy of Western civilization from our present day life. And the way that I experience it in England is that in England, we used to talk about the good old days. Now the elite talks about the bad old days. So the idea being is that we were really bad, we were horrible people. and we must be guilty. Sort of, and we must kind of beat ourselves up as to what has happened. And we got the situation where in the British Library, which is a major institution in London, they're reviewing every single important literary figure, and anybody that had an ancestor 200, 300 years ago that might have had slaves is immediately dealt with differently. It's almost like the sins of the father are so exaggerated now that who I am and my moral status is determined by something that happened 500 years ago. So that kind of very silly and destructive attempt to kind of leave the past behind and leave all of the gains of Western civilization behind and call them into question is a very powerful driver. It's got tremendous influence, and it gets to the point at which everything that's happened in the past has got a trigger warning on it now in some shape or form. I think that that's got to do with the fact that the cultural and political elites of the Anglo-American world the old ones have been displaced, and the new elites that have emerged have developed their authority on the basis that they're not like the old ones are. We're enlightened, we're aware. The number of times every time I hear the word "we're aware," we're here to raise your awareness, I feel like getting my metaphorical gun, because the argument that I'm going to raise your awareness is another way of saying I know far better than you what needs to, how you should think, and I'm going to tell you how you should behave. I'm going to tell you the language you can now use. I'm going to tell you what's inside your head, and either you accept that or we'll cancel you. And I think that kind of development has been very, very powerful. And unfortunately, the forces against it are a little bit too weak for my liking. And so, but nevertheless, there's the war ahead on this issue is going to be a really, really important one. In many ways, that is the key battle of the next 10, 15 years.
Now, let's say that I am someone who wants to be part of a worker cooperative. As much as I don't like, the current state of federal governments, it's very hard to change those. There's a lot of worker cooperatives you could either start or join. If I want to be an informed worker cooperative voter, what would you recommend? Like, would you recommend researching logical fallacies, understanding economics, understanding persuasion, understanding sales? What are some real things people can do today to become part of the democratic spirit that you're advocating?
Well, I think it depends on the context that we're in. And it seems to me, first of all, you got to have an idea of, what it is that you would like to see happen. So, you don't just simply get up in the morning and say, let's have a cooperative. I think what you got to decide is what is it that you want to cooperate about? What are the kind of values that bind you together? And what are the principles on which you're going to sort of move forward? And it seems to me that so getting that clear and organizing public sort of situations where you can argue and discuss this with other people is really quite important, because the way that you get people to own this project is if they feel that they've participated in its initiation. In other words, they feel that they had an input into what's going to come out of it, and that way they become committed to it rather than just being merely kind of passengers. So I think the key thing is to educate oneself about one's values, sort of being clear about one's beliefs, and sort of try to kind of merge that into a degree of pragmatism about what it is that what you see is your short-term interest in terms of economics or whatever the cooperation is about, and finding a way of fusing the basic principles with the pragmatic considerations that you're kind of undertaking. I think researching in particular the industry or the enterprise that you're kind of going to create is really quite important, especially when you start out. You have to know the community you're in, what kind of cooperation you can expect from people that are not part cooperative, where are you going to find your customers, for example, where are you going to find your supporters, all those things. You got to have some kind of plan kind of really being drawn out. From my experience, the key thing is to set a personal example, that people can see that through your behavior and what you're doing, you're reliable, you're responsible, you're methodical, you can be counted on. I mean, those are the things that people really value. And I would advocate kind of making sure that you live your life in accordance with those kinds of behavior patterns.
In the bibliography of your book, you cite Edward Bernays' Engineering of Consent. What are some of the big takeaways you learned from the work of Edward Bernays?
But what I learned was that there's a kind of arrogance that a lot of psychologists and public relations people have, where they think that they know us so well, so clever, that they can manipulate us into behaving in accordance with their objectives. So I find that kind of approach very anti-human, very anti-democratic. They kind of flatter themselves, so doing this. What they forget is that, yes, you and I can be influenced, and you and I can be manipulated, but it's always due not to the cleverness of an individual PR executive. It's due to the fact that there are, if organizations have got the resources, they're able to use those to kind of shape the way we live our lives. So, very often the media, for example, I used earlier on the example of Netflix, they can subliminally send out signals, particularly to young people, about what is really cool and what isn't cool, right? So they kind of learn that if you behave in this way, that's, oh man, that's really cool. If you behave that way, you're an idiot. And so in that way, they can kind of influence us to some extent. Or, struggle as kind of citizens is to try to find ways of negating that kind of influence by finding our own illustrations, our own examples of what is cool, what we in this community think is really cool, rather than being copycats of a Netflix kind of drama.
What is the thesis of your book, How Fear Works?
A bit difficult to summarize in one sentence, but basically what it's about is that we've lost the moral and cultural outlook to deal with fear. We tend to exaggerate threats, we inflate threats to the point at which everything is, even the smallest problem suddenly leaps out and becomes an existential fear. At the same time that we inflate fear, we also exaggerate our own powerlessness to deal with this. So basically, we tell people that you're vulnerable, you're weak, you're powerless, you can't really do very much about it. You need some kind of experts to sort this out. And because of that, fear in such circumstance can acquire this power to influence and shape our lives. And you saw that, well, you're seeing it even now under the pandemic, where people are quite prepared to trade in their freedom for the illusion of security that is being kind of given them, where all of a sudden a health problem, a threat to our health, is turned into a political problem that calls into question human existence. And I think you'll find that the number of threats that are now projected as, calling into question human existence is just multiplying all the time. So we have fear of an asteroid killing us, hitting the Earth. We have the global warming, the planet is going to disappear. We have global terrorism. We're all going to, face some kind of mass death as a result of that. We have global pandemics. So, we're getting to the point at which fear acquires its own dynamic. It almost has its own independent force. And it becomes, unfortunately, a medium to which we experience a lot of our lives. And as a result of this, we are less inclined to take risks, less inclined to experiment, less inclined to try things out. We just become, very, very insecure. And the dominant religion that we adopt in the Anglo-American world is that of safety. Stay safe, be safe. This is safe, this isn't safe. And of course, the minute safety has its own power over you, then you end up in a world, as you do in the United States, where you invent this silly idea of a safe space. Sort of, I don't know if you heard of safe spaces. So, we're going to have it. This is a safe space. Well, the minute you talk about a safe space, the assumption is that everything outside of it is unsafe. And that's really how fear works.
Now, in order to sort of, make sure we're not being manipulated by fear, there are some things that are real. You shouldn't get really drunk and then drive a car, but also you can go outside without catching COVID and it killing you if you're 20 and in good shape. So, how do you have any book recommendations that could sort of help the listeners think, along with myself, obviously? Do you have any book recommendations that help people think clearly, think logically, and think on principle, as opposed to always being scared by COVID, immigrants, terrorism, greed by corporations? Any book recommendations on how to think clearly and not get manipulated?
Well, that's a big ask because, in a sense, what you're really saying, how can we educate ourselves to become almost immunize ourselves from these fears, both real and irrational? And it seems to me that kind of to do that, sort of, it's not so much reading a book, but gaining confidence in your own power. That's really kind of critical. And that comes about through education. I mean, one of the things that I point out in my book, How Fear Works, is that if you study some of the classics like Aristotle, or some of the newer studies like Hannah Arendt's writings, you learn about the fact that some of the virtues, the classical virtues like courage, sort of, which we no longer talk very much about, or some of the classical virtues to do with judgment, exercising your judgment, are really quite important in this respect. And I think that if you educate yourself to understand that at the end of the day, you know what is in your best interest better than anybody else does, and that we collectively in a group are able to exercise common sense rather than need a quarantine to prevent our movements. If you can grasp those kinds of things, then I think one can begin to move in the right kind of direction. I work with an online magazine called Spiked Online, and if you look at some of the articles written on it, a lot of them, sort of promote different ways in which we can arm ourselves against guarding against this to children who must always have safety to kind of sort of have that kind of security, which I would advise people to read. I think that's quite a good place to start.
Well, Mr. Furedi, that is all the questions that I had for you. Do you have any final things you want to communicate to the audience? Maybe one major misconception of democracy that you'd like to communicate that I just totally forgot about?
I'm sure that there are many, but I come back to this one point about democracy, is that there's a difference between democracy as a piece of paper or as a procedure in the way that people talk about. Because for most people, democracy is about how you get somebody elected. And there's a difference between that and understanding that democracy is really about a way of life. And because it's a way of life, therefore, it's incumbent on all of your listeners, on everybody, to try to live as a democratic human being. So through your example, taking part in public life, arguing, giving a voice to your sentiments. I think those are the really crucial things. Not letting others make decisions for you, making sure that your voice is always heard, so that next day or the day after, you don't have to live with decisions that are not of your own making.
The book is Democracy Under Siege. Don't let them lock it down. For anyone interested, you can purchase the book on Amazon. Please see it in the link in the description below. Mr. Furedi, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Nice talking to you. Right.